HOA president followed us to the emergency room while my pregnant wife was bleeding. She didn't care about the medical emergency. She grabbed my wife and started dragging her off the hospital bed because our garage door was open. Then the security cameras captured everything that happened next. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The fluorescent lights of the emergency room burned into my memory that night. I can still see them flickering above my wife Sarah's pale face as she clutched her swollen belly, tears running down her cheeks in slow, helpless lines. 8 months along with our first child and she was bleeding. Red like panic on white sheets. "Please," Sarah whispered, so small against the clinical hum of the ER. "Please, something's wrong with the baby." I gripped her hand until my knuckles ached. Like holding on would stop the world from tipping. My chest hammered. The seconds between respiration and the next, shouted instructions stretched into an impossible distance. The nurse had promised they were preparing a room, that a physician would be with us any moment. Those moments turned into a cavern of waiting. Then she arrived. Margaret Hutchinson, HOA president, neighborhood petitioner, and apparently someone who believed bylaws trumped humanity. Around Riverside Meadows, she was known by a sharper nickname, Karen. 5 feet of posture and entitlement, hair pulled so tight it seemed to redraw the outline of her skull, lips compressed into their usual permanent expression of moral outrage. She carried her HOA binder like a talisman, pages of rules that to her read like scripture. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice slicing through the quiet of the waiting room as if she had permission to interrupt every crisis in the building. "You need to come with me right now." I stared at her, the question so simple it didn't need words. "Are you insane?" Sarah was pale and shaking and bleeding. The regular rhythm of the ER seemed to falter. Margaret's eyes pinched behind expensive frames. She hugged the binder to her chest like armor. "Your garage door has been open for 6 hours and 14 minutes, she intoned, reciting a precision that made my scalp crawl. "That's a direct violation of Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the HOA bylaws. Come home immediately and close it, or you'll be fined $500 per hour." She did the math out loud like a verdict. "That's already over $3,000 in violations." The waiting room for a moment became a theater. The crying child in the corner stopped mid-wail. A man nursing a broken arm lowered his magazine. An elderly woman undergoing a blood pressure check turned her head slowly. All eyes found us, then Margaret, then back to whatever story they'd been telling themselves about civility and order and whose suffering deserved attention. "My wife might be losing our baby," I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice, trying to keep from collapsing. The rage inside me was a pressure bubble, rising fast. "Your garage door rules can wait. We're in a medical crisis." Margaret moved closer, and the room filled with the mix of her perfume and the bitter aroma of stale coffee. "If everyone ignored the bylaws whenever convenient, the neighborhood would descend into chaos," she said, as if chaos were a plausible fate worse than a child dying on a gurney. "You signed the agreement when you bought the house. Ignorance is no excuse." Sarah made a small, guttural sound that cut me off. Her face had gone an ashen gray that didn't belong to a woman 8 months pregnant. Terror tightened every line. Her hands clutched at her abdomen as if she could hold the thing inside her in place by sheer force. "I need a nurse," I barked. The English I'd used in court 1,000 times now useless against the sight of my wife folding in on herself. "Someone help us, please!" Margaret did something I will never forget. Without a flicker of hesitation, she reached past me and grabbed Sarah's arm. The hand was steely, far stronger than her fragile frame suggested, and she began to tug. "If he won't come, then you'll have to make him see reason," she said, a perverse calm coating every word. "You can come back after he fixes this violation. First-time mothers always overreact," I shoved forward. "Get your hands off my wife." The sound that came out of me was not a sentence. It was an animal cry that bounced off linoleum and tile. Margaret yanked harder, pulling Sarah toward the edge of the bed. Sarah cried out, sharp, piercing, the kind of sound that made the monitor spike. The fetal heart monitor, attached and already concerned, began to beep erratically. Nurses swarmed. A line of voices raised into commands. "Stop!" Sarah screamed, half rising, terror raw in her voice. "Please, the baby! You're hurting the baby!" The words landed like a slap. Margaret's face flushed, righteous fury sculpting her features. "This neighborhood has standards, Mrs. Morrison," she said, inflicting the title like salt. "Your emergency doesn't justify disrespecting the community. Do you know how hard I work for property values? The hours I volunteer—" Her sentence died when 2 security guards, shoes squeaking on the hospital floor, moved between her and my wife. A nurse I hadn't seen before materialized with a face carved from professional alarm. They pulled Margaret away, but the damage had been done. Sarah curled up on the bed, body racked with sobs, clutching herself like a shell. The monitor's alarms were shrill and insistent, a chorus of warnings I couldn't silence. "We need a doctor now," the nurse said into her radio, voice snapping into urgent protocol. "Possible placental abruption. Patient is 8 months pregnant, in extreme distress. Get Dr. Kim here immediately." "No, no, no," I kept repeating, words small against the medical storm. I held Sarah's hand and felt the heat of it go cold under my thumb. "Baby, please, just hold on." What came next was a blur of fluorescent lights and quick-moving white coats. They rushed Sarah into emergency surgery while I was left in the hallway with my clothes stained and my hands slick with blood. I could not go into that room. The surgeon's sterile curtain drew a line I could not cross. I paced like an animal, calling out to hospital staff, signing forms with hands that shook so badly the pen skittered. When they finally wheeled her out of surgery, the diagnosis hit like a second injury. The baby had to be delivered prematurely. Our son arrived at 33 weeks, a slip of a thing at 4 pounds 2 ounces. They whisked him immediately to the NICU, a fragile bundle surrounded by pumps and tubes that regulated the most basic acts of living. He was wired to machines that inhaled and exhaled for him, tiny fingers and a thumb that seemed impossibly formed against a maze of plastic. I watched at a refrigerator-bright window at 3 in the morning. The world outside muffled and distant, while my son fought for every breath. A weight dropped into my gut, cold, dense, and heavy, everything circling back to it. Margaret's interference, her binder, her calculation of fines, felt like the hand that had pushed our life into that sterile corridor. The hospital had security footage of the whole encounter. I gave my statement to the police that night with a hand that trembled so badly I almost couldn't sign the forms. They arrested Margaret for assault in the hospital parking lot. She screamed that it was all a misunderstanding, that she'd merely been doing her duty. Her duty had nearly cost my wife and child their lives. Criminal charges were only the start. I wanted a remedy that would ensure she could never wield that power again. Sarah had been a civil rights lawyer before pregnancy took her from the courtroom to the hospital bed. She'd built careersable cases against corporations and governments, sharp and relentless in the face of injustice. As soon as she was alert enough to sit up, pale but burning with the old fire, she fixed me with a look I recognized from trial days. A look that meant the fight was about to leave the nurse's station and move into the halls of power. "We're going to destroy her," Sarah said quietly, the words coming from a voice still hoarse from intubation. Not just her. Every person on that HOA board who gave her the authority to behave like that. Everyone who enabled her reign. "Are you sure you're up for this?" I touched a damp strand of hair away from her forehead. She still looked so pale, so fragile, with dark circles under her eyes and bandages across her abdomen. "You need to focus on healing, David." She took my hand and squeezed it with surprising strength. That woman literally dragged me out of my hospital bed when I was begging for help. She could have killed our son. She could have killed me. Do you understand what could have happened? If that placental abruption had been complete, we would have both bled out before they could get me to surgery. Our baby would be dead. I would be dead. And she would have gone home to her perfect little house and slept soundly because she enforced her precious garage door rule. Tears were streaming down her face now, but her voice remained steady. "I'm going to make sure she never has the power to hurt anyone ever again. This is what I do, David. This is what I'm good at. And I have never been more motivated in my entire career." The civil lawsuit we filed 3 weeks later was massive and comprehensive. Assault, battery, intentional infliction of emotional distress, reckless endangerment, violation of civil rights. We went after Margaret personally and the HOA as an organization. We demanded every email, every meeting record, every complaint Margaret had ever filed, every text message, every notation in her precious binder. What we found made my blood boil even hotter than before. Margaret had been terrorizing our neighborhood for 3 years. The documentation was extensive and disturbing. She had filed complaints against a family for having pink flowers instead of red ones, insisting the color scheme violated the aesthetic standards. She had called Child Protective Services on a single mother because her grass was half an inch too long during a week when her son had the flu and she couldn't mow. She had tried to force an elderly veteran to take down his American flag because it was too large and ostentatious and didn't match the approved flag size in the bylaws. She had fined a family $2,000 because their Halloween decorations stayed up until November 2nd. She had reported a teenager to the police for suspicious activity because he was wearing a hoodie while walking to his own home. She had tried to ban a family service dog, claiming it was too large and violated pet restrictions, even though service animals are legally protected. But the worst part, the HOA board knew everything. They had received dozens of complaints about Margaret's behavior over the years, and they had done nothing. We found emails where board members discussed her aggressive enforcement style, but concluded it was beneficial because she kept property values up and maintained standards. They'd sacrificed the peace and well-being of the entire neighborhood to avoid confrontation with Margaret. Our lawyer, a fierce woman named Patricia Chen, who had worked with Sarah on previous cases, built our case like a fortress. She interviewed every neighbor who had suffered under Margaret's reign. The stories were heartbreaking and infuriating. One elderly man broke down crying as he described how Margaret had him fined for having a memorial bench for his late wife in his front yard. She said it violated that no furniture in visible areas rule. Patricia collected medical records showing Sarah's injuries in graphic detail and our son's premature birth complications. She had expert witnesses prepared to testify about the risks Margaret had created. She hired a forensic accountant to show how much money the HOA had spent in Margaret's frivolous enforcement actions. She brought in a psychologist to evaluate Margaret's pattern of behavior. But the piece that would win everything was the security footage from the ER. 3 months after that nightmare night, we finally had our day in court. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. It seemed like half our neighborhood had shown up. All the people who had been bullied and harassed by Margaret over the years. They wanted to see justice served. The bailiffs had to bring in extra chairs. People stood along the walls. The energy in the room was electric with anticipation. Margaret sat at the defendant's table in a perfect navy blue suit, her hair still pulled back in that severe bun. She looked calm, almost bored, like this was just another HOA meeting she had to attend. The HOA's lawyer, an expensive-looking man named Peyton in a $1,000 suit with perfect silver hair, kept whispering to her. She nodded occasionally, but mostly just stared straight ahead with that same expression of superiority she always wore. Sarah sat beside me in the gallery, and I could feel her shaking slightly. Our son, James, was home with Sarah's mother. He had finally been released from the NICU 2 weeks earlier. Still tiny and fragile, but breathing on his own, though he remained on oxygen support at night. The doctor said he would have developmental challenges because of his premature birth, speech delays, motor skill delays, possible learning disabilities. More reasons to hate Margaret with every fiber of my being. All rise, the bailiff announced in a booming voice, the Honorable Judge Marianne Foster presiding. Judge Foster was a black woman in her 60s with silver streaks in her natural hair and eyes that missed nothing. She had a reputation for being fair, but tough with no patience for nonsense in her courtroom. She had been a civil rights attorney before becoming a judge, and she had a particular disdain for abuse of authority. She took her seat and looked over the courtroom, with those sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see into everyone's soul. This is a civil case. Morrison versus Hutchinson and the Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association, she said, her voice commanding immediate attention. I've reviewed the preliminary materials, and I have to say this is one of the most disturbing cases I've seen in my 20 years on the bench. The allegations alone are shocking. Let's proceed and get to the truth of what happened. Patricia stood up, confident and commanding in her red suit. Your Honor, we will prove that Margaret Hutchinson's actions on the night of March 15th constituted assault, battery, reckless endangerment, and gross negligence. We will show that her abuse of power as HOA president directly led to the premature birth of my client's son and the serious injury sustained by Mrs. Morrison. We will demonstrate a pattern of behavior showing that this was not an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of years of escalating harassment and abuse of authority. The HOA's lawyer, Mr. Peyton, stood next, smoothing his expensive tie. Your Honor, while we certainly sympathize with the Morrisons' difficult situation, Mrs. Hutchinson was simply performing her duties as HOA president. Any physical contact was minimal, accidental, and unintentional. The premature birth cannot be definitively linked to the brief interaction. Mrs. Morrison's pregnancy was already high risk due to her age, and premature birth can occur for many reasons unrelated to. Save your arguments for testimony. Mr. Peyton, Judge Foster cut him off sharply. I want to hear from witnesses, not speculation. Ms. Chen, call your first witness. Sarah took the stand first. I watched her place her hand on the Bible, her fingers trembling slightly despite her outward composure, but when she started speaking, her voice was steady and strong. This was Sarah in her element, even as a witness in her own case. Tell us what happened on March 15th, Patricia said gently. Sarah took a breath and began. I was 8 months pregnant with our first child. That evening around 7:00 p.m., I started having severe cramping and bleeding. It wasn't normal pregnancy discomfort. I knew immediately something was very wrong. My husband David drove me to the emergency room at County General immediately. I was in significant pain and very frightened for my baby. What happened when you arrived at the ER? The staff was amazing and professional. They got me registered quickly, despite how busy they were, and told us they were preparing a room for examination. A nurse took my vital signs and assured me the doctor would see me within minutes. They were taking my condition very seriously. Sarah's voice caught and she paused to compose herself. Then Margaret Hutchinson appeared. Mrs. Hutchinson was at the hospital. No, she wasn't there for medical care. She followed us from our neighborhood. She came into the emergency room and started demanding that my husband leave immediately to close our garage door. She said it was an HOA violation and he needed to fix it right away or face thousands of dollars in fines. A murmur went through the courtroom like a wave. Even Judge Foster's eyebrows rose slightly, though she said nothing. "What was your response?" Patricia asked. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I was potentially losing my baby, bleeding, and in pain. And she was talking about garage doors like it was the most important thing in the world. My husband told her to leave, that we were dealing with a medical emergency and the garage door could wait. He was polite at first, trying not to cause a scene. And did she leave? Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained strong. No, she became more aggressive. She started raising her voice, saying, "Rules were rules and emergencies didn't excuse violations." Then she grabbed my arm. Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to touch the spot on her arm. She tried to pull me off the hospital bed. She literally started dragging me toward the edge. She said, if my husband wouldn't come, then I needed to make him see reason. She was pulling me with real force, and I was screaming for her to stop, begging her, telling her she was hurting the baby. What happened next? Security guards had to pull her off me, but I was hysterical by then. The pain had gotten exponentially worse, and I was terrified. The stress and physical trauma caused a partial placental abruption. That's when the placenta starts to separate from the uterine wall. It's extremely dangerous. They had to perform an emergency C-section immediately. My son was born at 33 weeks, weighing only 4 lb. He spent 6 weeks in the NICU, and we nearly lost him twice during that time. Patricia, let that sink in, letting the jury see Sarah's tears, her pain. Mrs. Morrison, had you or your husband ever had problems with Mrs. Hutchinson before this incident? Oh yes, Sarah said, and now there was anger in her voice alongside the pain. From the day we moved in 18 months ago, she was at our door with complaints. Our welcome mat was the wrong color. It was blue instead of the approved beige or brown. We parked facing the wrong direction once. Our porch light wasn't bright enough. Then a week later, she said it was too bright. She once knocked on our door at 10 at night because my husband had brought in the trash cans at 9:55. Instead of exactly 10, she stood there with her binder and her phone showing the timestamp. More murmurs from the gallery. I could see some of our neighbors nodding in recognition, their own faces showing remembered anger and frustration. Did you ever complain to the HOA board about her behavior? Multiple times. Wasn't emails. We attended board meetings. They always said Margaret was just doing her job maintaining community standards. They told us if we didn't like the rules, we shouldn't have moved into an HOA neighborhood. They completely dismissed our concerns and made us feel like we were the problem for not appreciating her dedication. Patricia nodded. Your witness, Mr. Peaton. The HOA's lawyer stood, and I immediately disliked the smug look on his face. He approached Sarah like he was about to expose some great deception. Mrs. Morrison, isn't it true that your pregnancy was considered high risk from the beginning? Objection, Patricia said immediately. Revens. I'm establishing that the premature birth may have had nothing to do with my client's actions, Peaton said smoothly. Judge Foster considered for a moment. I'll allow it, but tread carefully, Mr. Peaton. This better lead somewhere. Sarah lifted her chin defiantly. My pregnancy was not high risk. It was perfectly normal until Margaret Hutchinson assaulted me. But you're 38 years old, correct? First pregnancy at what's medically termed advanced maternal age. 38 is not elderly, Mr. Peaton. Women have healthy babies well into their 40s. My doctors had zero concerns about my pregnancy before Margaret Hutchinson physically attacked me in that emergency room. I had passed every test, every screening. My blood pressure was perfect. No gestational diabetes, no complications whatsoever. Assaulted is a very strong word, Mrs. Morrison. She grabbed me without my consent while I was in a medical emergency, and physically pulled me, dragged me while I was begging her to stop and explicitly telling her she was hurting my baby. What would you call that, Mr. Peaton? Peaton's jaw tightened, realizing Sarah was too sharp to trap. No further questions. Over the next 2 days, Patricia methodically built her case like constructing a building. Each testimony another brick in the wall. Our neighbors testified about Margaret's reign of terror with heartbreaking detail. Mrs. Chen, an elderly Chinese woman who had lived in the neighborhood for 20 years, broke down crying as she described how Margaret had reported her to the city for having a vegetable garden. My husband and I, we grew vegetables our whole lives. In China and California, always we grow food. It was our tradition, our joy. Margaret said it was ugly, that it violated aesthetic standards. She made the city force us to tear it all out. My husband died 6 months later. That garden was his happiness. The single mother, Amanda Rodriguez, testified about how Margaret's call to Child Protective Services had led to a traumatic investigation that terrified her children. My grass was a little long for maybe 5 days because my son had the flu and I was working double shifts to pay our bills. Margaret called CPS and told them I was neglecting my children. They came to our house, interviewed my kids at school without me there. My daughter had nightmares for months. She thought they were going to take her away from me. The elderly veteran, Thomas Washington, described how Margaret had tried to force him to take down his American flag. I served this country for 30 years. I fought in Vietnam. That flag means everything to me. She said it was too big, that I needed a smaller one. I told her that flag was folded on my brother's coffin when he died in combat. She didn't care. She just cared about her rules. Each story was more infuriating than the last. The courtroom was filled with anger and sympathy. Several jurors were visibly emotional. Even Judge Foster looked disturbed by the testimony. But the most powerful testimony came from Dr. Rachel Kim, Sarah's obstetrician, a woman with 30 years of experience in high-risk pregnancies. In my medical opinion, Dr. Kim stated clearly, looking directly at the jury, the stress and physical trauma Mrs. Morrison experienced that night directly caused the placental abruption that led to the premature birth. I have reviewed the medical records extensively. Mrs. Morrison was stable and healthy when she arrived at the hospital. The security footage shows Mrs. Hutchinson pulling on Mrs. Morrison's arm with significant force, while Mrs. Morrison was in visible distress. The timing is undeniable. Within minutes of this physical altercation, Mrs. Morrison's condition deteriorated rapidly. This was not coincidence. Could this have resulted in the death of mother or child? Patricia asked. Dr. Kim's face was grave. Absolutely. Placental abruption is a life-threatening emergency for both mother and baby. It can cause massive hemorrhaging. If it had been a complete abruption rather than partial, both Mrs. Morrison and her baby would have died before we could get her to surgery. Even with our quick intervention, it was touch and go. We nearly lost them both. The fact that they survived is testament to the quick action of the hospital staff and sheer luck. Not to any restraint on Mrs. Hutchinson's part. Patricia continued. What are the long-term consequences of this premature birth? Baby James will likely face developmental delays. Premature babies often have respiratory issues, which he's already showing. Speech delays are common. Learning disabilities, motor skill challenges. He'll require extensive therapy and medical care for years. All of this could have been avoided if Mrs. Hutchinson had simply walked away and let the medical professionals do their jobs. When Margaret finally took the stand on the third day, I leaned forward. This was what we had been waiting for. This was the moment she would have to answer for everything. Patricia approached her like a predator circling wounded prey. Mrs. Hutchinson, why did you go to the hospital that night? Margaret sat up straighter, her posture rigid and defensive. I was performing my duties as HOA president, which is a volunteer position I take very seriously. The Morrisons had an open garage door, which is a direct violation of our bylaws. I had tried calling and texting Mr. Morrison multiple times over several hours, but he wasn't responding to any of my communications. When I drove by their house at 8 p.m. and saw they still weren't home, I checked the hospital parking lot and saw their car, so I knew where they were. So you followed them to the hospital during what you must have known was an emergency. HOA violations don't pause for personal convenience, Ms. Chin. If we made exceptions for everyone who claimed to have an emergency, the entire system would collapse. People would abuse it constantly. The courtroom erupted in angry murmurs. Several people gasped audibly. Judge Foster banked her gavel hard. Order. I will have order in this courtroom, Patricia continued, her voice dripping with disdain. What went through your mind when you saw Mrs. Morrison in the emergency room, clearly in distress, visibly pregnant, crying? I thought that Mr. Morrison needed to handle his responsibilities to the community. Property values affect everyone in the neighborhood. When one person lets their standards slip, it impacts all of us. I've seen it happen before. One violation leads to another, and suddenly, the neighborhood looks terrible, and everyone's home value drops. You thought property values were more important than Mrs. Morrison's medical emergency. I didn't think it was as serious as they were making it out to be. People exaggerate medical situations all the time to get attention or avoid responsibilities. My hands clenched into fists so tight my knuckles turned white. Sarah put her hand on my arm, holding me back, keeping me grounded. You didn't think it was serious, Patricia repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the air. Even though Mrs. Morrison was in an emergency room, visibly pregnant, crying and telling you something was wrong with her baby, Margaret's face wrined slightly. In my experience, people, especially young people, exaggerate emergencies all the time. They think their problems are more important than everyone else's. I've dealt with countless residents who claimed emergencies to avoid HOA responsibilities. So, you decided you knew better than the patient herself, better than the medical staff who were treating her. I wastering to enforce the rules that everyone agreed to follow by physically dragging a pregnant woman out of a hospital bed. I barely touched her. I just tried to get her attention because her husband wasn't listening to reason. Patricia smiled, but it wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of an attorney who knows she has her opponent exactly where she wants them. You barely touched her, Your Honor. I'd like to play the security footage for the court. I believe this is the moment the courtroom has been waiting for. Proceed, Judge Foster said, her voice tight with controlled anger. The lights dimmed and a large screen descended from the ceiling. The courtroom went completely silent, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife as the video began to play. There we were, frozen in the worst moment of our lives. The footage was crystal clear. High-definition security cameras with perfect audio. You could see every detail. Sarah on the hospital bed, her face twisted in pain and fear. One hand on her belly and one gripping the bed rail. You could see me standing beside her, holding her other hand, my face showing clear panic and distress. You could hear the ambient noise of the ER. Machines beeping, staff moving, other patients talking, the general chaos of a busy emergency room. Then Margaret entered the frame like a storm cloud. Watching it again made me feel physically sick. My stomach churned and I tasted bile. You could see Margaret striding up to us with purpose, her HOA binder clutched against her chest like a weapon. You could hear every single word she said about garage doors and bylaws and fines, her voice sharp and demanding. You could see the shock and disbelief spreading across my face as I realized she was actually serious, actually demanding I leave my wife to close a garage door, and then you could see her grab Sarah's arm. Please. Sarah's voice came through the speakers high and desperate and filled with terror. Please, the baby. Something's wrong. Margaret yanked harder, her face showing determination and self-righteous anger. Sarah's body twisted on the bed, pulled by Margaret's surprising strength. You could see the 4-line pulled taut, the needle shifting in Sarah's hand. You could see Sarah's other hand pressed protectively over her belly, trying to shield our baby from harm. Margaret was literally dragging her toward the edge of the bed. Stop! Sarah's scream echoed through the courtroom, raw and primal. Please, the baby. You're hurting the baby. But Margaret kept pulling, kept dragging. Her lips were moving, and you could hear her saying something about standards and community responsibility. Even as Sarah screamed, you could see me trying to push between them, trying to break Margaret's grip without hurting anyone. The footage continued, showing security rushing over in their dark uniforms, showing the nurse's panicked face as she realized what was happening, showing the monitors going crazy with alarms that filled the audio. It showed Sarah curled up on the bed sobbing hysterically, her whole body shaking, while Margaret stood there arguing with security about HOA violations and how she was just doing her job, and they had no right to touch her. The video showed the medical staff swarming around Sarah, showed the doctor running in, showed them rushing her away on the bed while I ran alongside holding her hand. And it showed Margaret still standing there, still clutching her binder, looking indignant and wronged. When the video ended and the lights came up, the courtroom exploded. People were crying openly. Jurors looked horrified. One woman in the gallery shouted, "Monster!" Before the bailiff quieted her, several jurors had tears streaming down their faces. The jury foreman looked at Margaret with undisguised disgust and rage. Even Peyton, Margaret's expensive lawyer, looked pale and shaken. He whispered something urgent to Margaret, who shook her head stubbornly. Judge Foster looked at Margaret with an expression of pure, undiluted disgust. "Mrs. Hutchinson, do you still maintain that you barely touched Mrs. Morrison?" Margaret's face had gone pale, but she lifted her chin defiantly, still clinging to her self-righteousness like a life raft. The video doesn't show the full context. It doesn't show all the times the Morrisons violated rules. It doesn't show how I've dedicated 3 years of my life to that neighborhood without any appreciation. It shows everything that matters, Judge Foster said coldly, her voice cutting like a blade. It shows a woman in obvious medical distress being physically assaulted, being dragged while begging for mercy. It shows you prioritizing a garage door over human life. It shows you continuing to argue about bylaws while a woman was being rushed to emergency surgery. Mrs. Hutchinson, I have presided over thousands of cases in my career, and I have rarely seen such callous disregard for human life. Your Honor, I object, Peyton started desperately. Overruled. Sit down, Mr. Peaton, before I hold you in contempt for wasting this court's time. Judge Foster turned back to Margaret. Mrs. Hutchinson, in my courtroom, I have seen many things. I have seen criminals, liars, and people who have done truly terrible things. But I have rarely seen someone show such absolute callous disregard for human life in pursuit of something so completely, utterly trivial. You traumatized a pregnant woman. You endangered her life and her baby's life, and for what? A garage door. Homeowners Association rules. Margaret opened her mouth, but Judge Foster held up her hand. I'm not finished. The video doesn't lie. We have all seen you grab a pregnant woman who was in medical distress and physically attempt to remove her, to drag her from emergency care. We have heard her begging you repeatedly to stop. We have seen you continue despite her clear distress, despite her screams, despite medical staff trying to help her. There is absolutely no interpretation of those facts that makes your actions anything less than assault, battery, and reckless endangerment. None. Patricia called her final witness, Dr. James Martinez, a forensic psychologist who had reviewed all of Margaret's HOA complaints, communications, emails, and behavior patterns over 3 years. In my professional opinion, Dr. Martinez testified, adjusting his glasses. Mrs. Hutchinson displays classic signs of narcissistic personality disorder, with pronounced authoritarian tendencies. She shows a complete lack of empathy for others, an obsessive need for control over her environment, and an inability to recognize appropriate social boundaries. The pattern of her behavior over 3 years shows clear escalation from minor complaints to increasingly aggressive enforcement tactics. The incident with Mrs. Morrison was not an isolated event or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was the predictable culmination of increasingly dangerous behavior that went unchecked by any oversight. The closing arguments were powerful and emotional. Patricia painted a devastating picture of a woman drunk on petty power who had terrorized an entire neighborhood 4 years and finally crossed the line from harassment into violence. She demanded full compensation for medical expenses, which had exceeded $200,000 for the premature birth and NICU stay. She demanded compensation for pain and suffering for Sarah's permanent physical scars and ongoing trauma, and she demanded punitive damages large enough to send a message that this behavior would never be tolerated. Peaton tried his best to argue that Margaret had made an error in judgment, but hadn't intended any harm, that she was simply overzealous in her duties. But the jury's faces showed clearly that they weren't buying it for a second. They had seen the video. They had heard the testimony. They knew exactly what Margaret was. Judge Foster charged the jury with their instructions and sent them to deliberate. We waited in the hallway outside the courtroom, Sarah leaning against me, both of us exhausted from 3 days of reliving our worst nightmare. The jury returned in less than 3 hours. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Foster asked. The jury foreman stood, her face showing righteous anger. We have, Your Honor. On all charges we find in favor of the plaintiffs, we award $300,000 in compensatory damages and $2 million in punitive damages. Against Margaret Hutchinson and the Riverside Meadows HOA, the courtroom exploded in applause and cheers. Sarah cried tears of relief. People were hugging, celebrating. Judge Foster let it continue for a full minute before banging her gavel. Furthermore, Judge Foster said, and the courtroom quieted immediately, I am issuing permanent injunctions. Mrs. Hutchinson, you are permanently barred from serving in any HOA leadership position anywhere in this state. You are barred from filing complaints against neighbors except through proper legal channels. You are ordered to undergo mandatory anger management and psychological evaluation for 2 years. She continued, the Riverside Meadows HOA will immediately revise bylaws to include proper checks on authority, establish a complaint review process, hire professional management within 60 days, and issue formal apologies to all who testified about Mrs. Hutchinson's abuse. Judge Foster looked directly at Margaret. You took the most vulnerable moment of this family's life and made it worse because of your ego. You literally dragged a pregnant woman out of her hospital bed during a medical emergency over a garage door. I hope you spend the rest of your life reflecting on what you did, though I doubt you're capable of it. Margaret finally broke. This is unfair. I was doing my job. If you continue speaking, I will hold you in contempt. Margaret sat down, her reign of terror finally over. The criminal trial came months later. Margaret took a plea deal. She was sentenced to 18 months in jail, 3 years probation, and 1,000 hours of community service at a women's shelter. The HOA collapsed. Board members resigned. A new board eliminated Margaret's ridiculous restrictions. People could have gardens, any color flowers they wanted, and actually live their lives. We put most of the money in a trust for James's ongoing medical needs. We started a foundation helping families with premature babies in the NICU. 2 years later, I played with James in our yard. He chased butterflies, laughing despite his delays. Our garage door was open, tools scattered around. Sarah came out with lemonade. James ran over. "Butterfly, Mama," he said in his small voice. I looked at my family. Margaret had moved away after jail, unable to face what she'd done. The nightmare had been real. The courtroom exploding when they saw that tape. The justice we fought for. But we survived. We fought back, we won. We proved that decency always triumphs over tyranny. Always. If you enjoyed the story and want to support, you can always hit the little thanks button below. I'm slowly improving the channel, so if you like this one, drop a kind word. It really helps keep me going. Until next time, keep your ground solid and your water clear. Thanks for watching HOA Secrets. Share this video with someone who loves a good plot twist.